Located equidistant from Chicago and Des Moines, the city of Davenport, Iowa constructed a wonderful new art museum. The Figge Art Museum, designed by the famous British architect David Chipperfield, sits dramatically on the banks of the great Mississippi River. Between September 18th and January 9th of 2011, the featured exhibition at the museum was Dancing Towards Death, with artworks from the Richard Harris collection. The exhibition is an art-historical visual journey through the mediums of painting, drawing, prints, sculptures, photographs, and books, all relating to the essence of our mortality.
This is a fruitwood sculpture carved in the 17th century. It is a figure of a skeleton, a rotting corpse, where you can see the shards of his skin peeling off to reveal his bones, and he stands with a very sort of cocky, comfortable pose and is gazing at us. And he was probably part of a cabinet of curiosities that a collector had. It is a very blatant reminder that death comes to all, death is inevitable, and that it is omnipresent. This is by Albrecht Dürer, one of the most famous printmakers of the German Renaissance. It represents a beautiful woman dressed in bridal gown. She's wearing a crown of a young bride, and she's about to be kissed by a very burly looking man. And in most instances that would be perceived as sort of a kiss of fertility. But instead his true identity is revealed by the herald and the shield that is not visible to the girl, to the young maiden, but to us. And so it suggests that here he is almost giving the girl a kiss of death, that she's about to die. This is a 17th century artist, Adriaan van Utrecht, who specialized in these bountiful, opulent displays of wealth and power. This is a still life, what is called a Vanitas still life. As you can see here, we have a beautiful bouquet of rare and expensive flowers, as well as beautiful gilded cups, as well as this gorgeous nautilus shell. At the same time, though, with this sort of opulent display of beauty and wealth, we also have very subtle and not quite so subtle reminders of death. All of these are subtle reminders that all of this beauty and opulence will come to an end, and that ultimately does not matter when it comes to death. A lot of these images were also represented or accompanied by verses, a dialogue between the living and the dead. And the living people would try to argue why they should not die. They would try to sort of argue with the figure of death. And sometimes death would often wear and carry the attributes of the living person, and he often danced with a much greater vigor than the living person, and almost as if he was absorbing the very life energy of the person. So the medieval dance of death pretty much remained unchanged until the Renaissance, when Hans Holbein really picked up the political and social undertones, the message of death as the great equalizer, and used it as a way of critiquing the feudal aristocracy and the Catholic Church. He located them in very, very specific time and place. And we begin with scenes of the Genesis, where death appears once Adam and Eve have sinned. Holbein tried to point out the sins and foibles of humanity, as well as sort of critiquing the political and cultural social structures of that time. And you also have here death in the guise of a peasant who has laid down as his thresher and is killing the nobleman with a very heraldic shield that represented the power. So it's representing this sort of the class struggles that were taking place over that time. In this image of the nun, you can see the nun who, instead of praying and focusing her prayers on God, she's instead distracted by this handsome young troubadour. And later, of course, in the 18th, 19th century, the religious imagery completely fell away and was replaced by this sort of more secular approach to death. Death sort of visits the living in their everyday activities. He ambushes them. In the medieval dance of death, the living people were not surprised by the figure of death coming towards them. The moment of death took place in a very abstract space. Some images of death, of the dance of death, had a much more humorous bent to them. This sort of series by the English 18th century artist Rowlandson represents the figure of death as sort of the person who kills people through their own folly. Here he is painting a portrait distracting an elderly, decrepit man from noticing the dalliance that his much younger wife is having with the stud behind him. And it seems to suggest that, this old man in his folly and his presumption married a much younger woman and now will suffer from it. He will die and she will be able to live a much sort of happier life with her much younger lover. Well, some dances of death, the images that we have seen have been by very famous artists like Albrecht Dürer and Adriaan van Utrecht, but also really pretty anonymous figures dealt with that theme of death. And one of my favorite series in this particular dance is by this artist Fabian Guyané, who's a Hungarian artist. And he here is representing the dance of death. He's reflecting on World War I. And how it decimated the population and completely transformed the world in which people lived in. And here you have the figure, one of my favorite images of death, disguised as a young maiden, waving goodbye, saying goodbye to young soldiers who are going to war and to their deaths. And here you have death resting, as a farmer, resting near his harvest. And instead of shocks of hay and corn, you have bodies of young soldiers who have died in World War I. One of the sort of sub-themes of the Dance of Death is the theme of death and the maiden. In the Dance of Death, often the desiccated form of the skeleton is often juxtaposed with the sort of voluptuous form of a woman. This theme was picked up and took on a life of its own, picked up by Renaissance artists who used it as an opportunity to sort of showcase beautiful nude women and also reflect upon the male viewer's gaze and his desire to consume this woman. The Dance of Death was such a popular subject matter that it was reproduced and created by not great artists, but also just it was kitsch art of the everyday. And these are little porcelain figurines after medieval Dance of Death, the Basel Dance of Death. They were little sort of probably tourist tokens that one could acquire, and they're from the 19th century. And as you can see, representing death visiting both women and men. Here he is sort of in mock reverence, bowing down to the nun. And he's also visiting a mother and her young child. In the medieval Dance of Death, the theme begins with how death came into the world through the original sin, and death was only vanquished through the salvation of Christ and his great sacrifice and resurrection. We have here a nice little selection of works by the Flemish artist James Ensor, 19th century artist, who was throughout his life fascinated with the subject matter of death. The image right here that we have of death brandishing an enormous black scythe and chasing a mob, a horde of people from a variety of social classes. You can see policemen, a woman with a child. Ensor had a very macabre and pessimistic view of humanity. And this almost seems to hearken upon sort of older judgment scenes, because right above you see some kind of a sun, and on the right you have flames that suggest flames of hell, and somewhat cherubic figures on the left. So it's really sort of highlighting the ugly aspect of humanity. But in these two images, he actually is very humorous. Here, this particular image is called My Portrait in 1960. This is a 19th century artist, so he is mocking himself. A lot of artists dealt with the subject of death and whether or not their art could overcome death, whether the art that we created was a token of a sign, a way of remembering the life of the artist, a way that they could be remembered for posterity's sake. His morbid fascination with death was also reflected in these sort of a series of portraits he did, where the first of the images was actually a self-portrait of himself, but then he erased his image, erased his face, and instead drew over a skeleton over his face. So there's sort of it plays with this idea of the double, of death and the double, where death and life are so very much intertwined that we can't even really distinguish them that well. This is by Dada artist Georg Groß, German artist who painted in between the two wars. And this can be interpreted as a dance of death. This was created a year before he died, once he had emigrated to the United States. It's a collage of cut out scenes from various magazines, men and women, and then he has taken other cutouts of skulls and placed them over the faces of the people. The Dada movement tried to disturb conventional approaches of what is fine arts or not by trying to use the very stuff of modernity to create art. So here he's using just a rough cardboard and newspaper clippings to create art.